Hello everybody. Welcome to today's Migration Policy Centre seminar webinar. Welcome to those in the room, also to those who've joined us online. It's great to see everybody. Today, what we're going to have is a presentation by Dr. Eleonora Milazzo from the Migration Policy Centre, and she's going to be presenting work which forms part of a Horizon Europe project called Innovate, which will be explained. And the title of today's presentation is How to Build Stronger, More Effective Engagement, Insights on Research Policy Collaboration within Horizon-funded projects. So Eleonora will speak for 20-25 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for discussion, and obviously encouraging those online also to participate in the discussion. You could do that by typing into the chat, or also if you just want to put your hand up, we can come to you for any questions you have. Without further ado, very happy to invite Eleonora to present.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here this afternoon, both in the room and online. So before we get started with the work that I'm going to present this afternoon, just a brief introduction as a way of context for this piece of work. So the work that I'm going to present now, it's part of the Innovate project. This is an Horizon coordination and support action coordinated by Andrew Geddes here at the MPC, which we started about a year ago. It's going to run until March 2027, and it's a set of activities carried out by a consortium of 12 organizations. The main objective of the project is to build stronger and more effective engagement between migration research policies and practices. And the way we would like to do that is essentially by building capacity to engage with research evidence, increase demand for evidence, incentivize engagement and the uptake of research findings. More practically, we have started doing that through the Migration Research to Policy Collab, which is the centerpiece of the project. It's an online platform with various components. You can find a research exchange where we share insights from large-scale collaborative projects through various formats. There's also an engagement hub with practical tools to strengthen engagement, and where we're also going to conduct behavioral research on how people respond to research evidence. And we have a training facility with the first training on engagement methods taking place here at the UI in March, on the 18th of March. And finally, we're going to have very soon processing innovation actions. These are activities where we apply and we test these engagement methods that we are elaborating as part of the project. So to learn more about the context for the research that I'm going to present this afternoon, please feel free to refer to the website of the Migration Research to Policy Collab. So coming to the topic of today's seminar, I'm going to present joint work conducted by 7 of the 12 partners of the Innovate project. We have looked between June and December last year, we looked at engagement in the framework of Horizon-funded projects on migration. So I'm now going to share some insights into what we have found. Just to give you an overview of my talk, the next 20 minutes or so, I'm first going to present what is the problem, the central problem we are looking at. I'm then going to give you a bit more information about the research that we have conducted, and I will then dive into the draft report that that we have been working on, which looks at experiences of engagement, research design, and project setup under the Horizon program and the impact section of Horizon proposals. And I will then conclude with the preliminary takeaways that we have from this work on how to strengthen engagement. If there's any question, feel free to jump in, interrupt me. If not, we will wait for the Q&A. Right. So what is the problem we are looking at with this work? One way to systematize the problem we are grappling with is a multidimensional engagement paradox. What is this about? Hello, welcome. So what is this about? We frame the engagement paradox as multiple tensions. On the one end, between the large-scale expansion of the evidence-based research on migration in the last years, and at the same time, the perception of low levels of impact of this research. We also see on the one end an increase, a very significant investment in research, particularly in this case by the EU, and at the same time the perception of little returns for the funders, for the EU in this case, in terms of actionable findings. And finally, we see, and we have to grapple with, on the one end, a constant demand for facts, and a resistance or even immunity to these facts, or to incorporating these facts into policymaking. So how do we approach this? First of all, the objective. So we look at three main questions in this research report. The first one is how researchers and policymakers involved in Horizon-funded projects experience and define engagement. The second questions that we ask is what factors and project features of projects funded under the Horizon program they see as facilitating or hampering engagement. And finally, we asked researchers and policymakers involved in these projects what they think is needed to build stronger engagement around the findings that they produce. So the question is then obviously why Horizon program? Why the Horizon program? Well, first of all, because it's a large-scale research projects with extremely significant funding over the years. In particular, we look at Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe, spanning a period of over 10 years, in which the total investment in migration-related research has been around 160 million, with 55 plus projects funded in this 10 years. And here you can see also a breakdown by topic. So this is from the latest report of the European Commission on the Horizon program. You can see the breakdown of topics. It's interesting to also see that this is probably going to change in the next years. What is also interesting about the Horizon program, as you know very well, is that there are clear expected impact of objectives and very clear engagement components foreseen and required for funding under this program. And at the same time, we have a community of scholars and extremely meaningful examples of engagement and impact around these projects in the course of 10 years. Still, despite this, we also see very clear examples of the engagement paradox that I outlined. So the approach that we take to this this problem, and in particular looking at the Horizon program, is first of all looking at the EU research policy frames, in particular when it comes to the societal function of research that is embedded very clearly in the Horizon program. And we also want to move beyond the view of research impact or of a sort of linear transmission chain between research and policy, so the sort of more traditional view of impact. We rather take the approach of sort of knowledge exchange in migration research, with the challenges and also risks that come with it. So this is why what we look at is not impact, but engagement as a broad umbrella term that encompasses different forms of methods and methods of connections between researchers and policymakers. And as I said, we look at the whole engagement process, from building capacity to engage with evidence down to increasing the uptake of this evidence. So for this research report, we did a mapping of the 57 Horizon projects on migration funded between 2014 and 2024. And as a group, we conducted 69 semi-structured interviews, focusing on 38 Horizon projects. So we spoke to researchers, policymakers, and practitioners from the research consortia, as well as to external stakeholders involved in the projects in various capacity. And what I'm going to present now is very much work in progress, due very soon. So again, your feedback is very welcome. So let's go back to the actual report after this introduction. The first thing that we look at in the report is experiences of engagement of researchers, policymakers, practitioners involved in this 57. Well, we spoke to 38 out of 57 research projects, Horizon projects. So the first finding when it comes to their experiences of engagement during the projects is that there's a very clear shared goal motivating a engagement of both researchers and policymakers or practitioners. And this goal is twofold. It's both knowledge production, so advancing knowledge on specific migration issues, and also policy change, changing the status quo, improving the status quo with respect to a specific migration issue. Researchers and policymakers, we found, tend to assess positively collaboration around this shared goal. And they value the Horizon project design because it sort of balances both research-driven and policy-oriented objectives that, in this sense, favor their engagement towards this goal. So when these objectives, both research-driven and policy-oriented one, are formulated realistically, we're going to come back to that, supported by appropriate methods, and also accompanied by regular interactions, they provide a strong foundation for engagement in the experience of our sample. The second finding that we have is that beyond these shared goals, project partners experience engagement ambivalently, because they sort of differ in terms of the approaches to the research work, to their priorities, and also to the sort of timeline that they look at when they start working on the project. These differences, these divergences, can in fact be associated with either positive or negative experiences of engagement. And we are going to look at other factors that might influence that in a second. But the key point here is that what we found is that it is true that policymakers and researchers, like we can expect, do have different approaches to the same research questions, but this does not necessarily represent a challenge or an obstacle to their collaboration. We also found, when it comes to experiences of engagement, that pre-existing differences or perceived differences between, in this case, to simplify, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners do play a significant role. We have a strong dichotomy here between the sacrality of evidence, as it came up in some of the interviews, and immunity to evidence. Very much part of the paradox we started with. So on the one end, we see the perception that researchers resist simplifications of their findings, and on the opposite side, we have a very strong perception of policymakers being resistant to research findings when these do not align with the agenda they are implementing or acting upon. This is obviously more of a continuum rather than a strong dichotomy. But as a simplification, I think it sort of renders the idea that, first of all, there's a perception of the research process as disconnected from policy cycles. At the same time, there's an understanding of lack of knowledge about what kind of information policymakers need and when they need that information. And also a strong perception that findings are used selectively to legitimize existing policy choices. So a lot there to work with in terms of what to do to build stronger engagement around research findings. So we now move to what factors or features about the research design and project setup foreseen by the Horizon program are seen as facilitating or hampering engagement. In terms of factors facilitating engagement, what we found is, first of all, the collaborative research design is assessed very, very, very positively in terms of the sort of basis it provides for engagement across spheres. And so this involves, for example, cross-project cooperation, so cooperation between sister projects, the comparative case study approach that is very often adopted within Horizon projects, and the systematic stakeholder engagement that is embedded throughout projects. We also see an important role being associated with prior experience with similar EU funding sources, and also clear and simple communication. This is something else that is very strongly valued as facilitating engagement, expectedly, with an important role for knowledge brokers, or those who are best placed to facilitate the dissemination and uptake of research evidence, particularly in the case of project consortia, think tanks, or policy research institutes. When it comes to factors or features that are seen as problematic for engagement, we have indication that final project outcomes tend to shift and to take a predominant academic focus. So while towards the beginning of the project, we have a picture of much of a greater balance between research-oriented and policy-driven objectives and activities. This doesn't seem to be perceived in the same way towards the end of the project. And this is associated with various issues. There are issues with time management and overcommitment that come up, but also the very high number of deliverables that projects commit to and then have to sort of juggle, coordination issues, and also funding allocation issues related to that. We also have very strong indications that the lack of professional engagement capacity or institutionalized engagement capacity is perceived as a very strong limitation to the level of engagement that a project can reach during its duration, and stakeholder involvement, if not regular, if not sustained throughout projects, can also become a limitation. And finally, we have a general conflation between engagement or impact and one-way communication of results, particularly at the very end of research projects. So a very good example is final project conferences. They're very often implicitly associated with engagement, impact, and so on, but in fact end up being very much one-way, a formal one-way communication of findings, particularly because they do not have any follow-up or feedback on that same findings and their potential application for policy. Okay, so nearing the end of the presentation, we also asked our interviewees about the impact section of Horizon proposals. Is the impact strategy helpful as a tool? And here, the sort of responses that we have point to mixed results. On the one end, the impact strategy is assessed as a potentially useful programmatic tool, but at the same time, impact objectives are formulated very often in unrealistic terms. This is for reasons that we can guess, particularly regarding the competitiveness of the Horizon call, as a which very often leads to impact objectives or in general the sort of risk of overcommitting to extremely ambitious impact objectives. We also see that in general, impact or the results of a project are very strongly associated with how the engagement process during the project develops. Both policymakers and practitioners tend to agree on the fact that if project outputs are not co-designed, in particular, they're not agreed upon and designed together, they tend to be not implementable or of limited practical value, particularly for policymakers and practitioners. While as I said before, researchers themselves tend to associate impact, final impact, with the publication of policy recommendations, similar instruments like toolboxes, final conferences, and so on, but they themselves are uncertain or skeptical about the actual applicability of these products. And obviously, the very strong consideration is also that impact remains difficult to establish because of the lack of any post-project follow-up to get a sense of how far the findings have gone in terms of engagement. So to conclude, some takeaways on how to strengthen engagement. So I think I summarized 4 points, 4 preliminary takeaways from this work. The first one, there's a very clear indication to focus on engagement as a process, potentially generating impact rather than impact as a metrics of success by itself. The second point, very important to balance out research-driven and policy-oriented objectives, and to do that since the early project design stage and then throughout the project, making sure that time and funding allocation reflect that balance. Another important takeaway to address the lack of institutionalized engagement capacity, so both during the project and in the post-project phase. This is part also what the Migration Policy Collab is currently doing. So it's important that there is also a strong indication in this respect. And secondly, this is especially in relation to the dichotomy / continuum between the sacrality of evidence on the one end and the immunity on the other end, understanding how research findings are processed and how to communicate them more effectively, rather than sort of sticking to a black and white view of research policy communication. Thank you very much. I will leave it at that, and looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Eleonora. Sounds like a fantastic project, this one.
It's coordinating it.
Yeah. Big congratulations to whoever that is. So what we've got now, some time for Q&A. We've got some people in the room, people online. Everybody's welcome to ask questions. For those online, if you want to put your hand up or write text in the chat box, you'll feel free to do so. Maybe we'll start in the room if anybody would like to kick off. Anybody's got any questions in the room? Please, could you introduce yourself as well for everybody online?
Okay. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much for the presentation. Super interesting. My name is Ann-Kathrin Reinl, and I'm a research fellow here at the Robert Schuman Center. And I was wondering, so I really think your results are super relevant and also insightful. And how far do you think they might also travel to other policy fields or other types of Horizon Europe projects? Because here now you decided to just focus on migration-related projects. So in how far are your findings also relevant outside this specific group of projects?
Yeah, thanks. It was really interesting presentation. So I have two issues or questions. One, I mean, does your project also include analysis or reflection on how the expectations might have changed on the European Commission side, and maybe also look at how the calls have developed? Because I think I've noticed a change in the way the things are worded, what the expectations are, but because we talk a lot about empathy, so in a way, one thing would be to try to understand, one important thing would be to understand how the kind of demand for this research is being formulated. And the second point, so I don't know actually what share of institutions who win these grants are academic institutions versus other types of institutions, but I mean, has this whole change in the academic environment and the kind of pressures and the job market come up as issues that affect engagement with Horizon projects?
Yes, hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm Leila Giannetto, Research Fellow here at the MPC. So I have two small questions. Well, let's see if small. So one is about really your interviewees. What level of policymakers did you interview? Were they especially European level, national, local? And just to have an idea of the type of idea of engagement that each and every different policy actor and practitioner has in the group, in the sample that you interviewed. And also, what if you've picked up on the differences between impact strategies that focus on, as you say, researchers usually go for conferences or policy recommendations as an output instead of sometimes like audio, video type of outputs. So I was wondering whether you picked up on differences on how policymakers and practitioners perceive these two types of policy of outputs overall.
Yes, thanks very much for the question. And again, feel free to jump in, Andrew. I also see some of the co-authors of this research report on Zoom, so please feel free to come in as well. So how far do you think this might travel to other fields? This is an important question. I think what is really sort of distinctive about migration, which might also apply to other fields, is that this is clearly a field where research findings are contested, where evidence is contested. And where all the different components of the engagement paradox are very present. And I think we can think of other fields where this is the case as well. I think at the moment, climate change, so the impacts and policy solutions around that, I think they have many things in common. We are partly going to look at that. We're going to look at the intersection in a way. One of the pilot projects that I briefly mentioned is about migration in the context of climate change. And so I think for that, it is also relevant to understand how research findings are sort of processed in that context. So we're going to do some work on that too. So expectations and how the calls have developed. So this is, I think, also an interesting question looking at the next few years, the next funding cycles. At the moment, what we have looked at is the evolution, especially in terms of the impact section and the impact components, and this is something that comes up as having become more demanding in a way. So the perception is that impact has gained much more relevance in the second cycle. But obviously it would be interesting to look at the development of the calls in much more detail. For example, we don't focus at the moment, we might, but we don't focus on the various topics, on the, I just briefly showed the breakdown by topic. This is also very interesting, also in light of how the funding is very likely or will evolve in the future. So in terms of the academic institutions, other type of institutions, we haven't done a systematic mapping of how many institutions of what type are involved in this 50 plus projects. But certainly what does come up is that the job market, the sort of pressure from the job market as indirect effects on how many resources are put into engagement. I referred briefly to time sort of management issue, funding allocation issues. Particularly the researchers we spoke to report a very strong pressure to sort of publish academic papers, which contributes to sort of leaving other type of formats on the sideline. So in this sense, I think there's an indirect impact there. Interviewees. So the level, so this is maybe something where we should be more specific in the report. I think we have policymakers at the EU and local level, local/regional level, but not at the national level in terms of policymakers we are spoken to. And certainly, yes, there are differences. So all interviewees, I think, across the board refer to differences in their perception of, for example, academic articles, very long reports, and sort of podcast, video, audio, and so on. Although what it's really significant there, I think the example of toolboxes is significant. There's an extent to which, regardless of the output, if there has not been a co-design process leading to that output, the perception of sort of relevance is still affected. So again, so this is why we wrote that what really matters is the sort of process rather than or more than the sort of final output, although that has a role as well.
Thanks, Eleonora. So I think we've got a question in the room from, but before we also got there's just a question online which came from Isabella G, and it's just been moved on my screen, but it was a question about the idea of a research gap. Would you use the word words research gap? And then Margaret has also, I think this is a comment, personally thought there is a plethora of migration research and policy interest, and makes a point about this being politicized and weaponized at times. So the issue seems to be what is actually adopted and how well it is implemented. It's kind of more of a comment, but I think the question from Isabella was about the idea of a research gap, and would you refer to gap, a research policy gap or gaps? And then Lorenzo, you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eleonora, for a very comprehensive and clear presentation. My name is Lorenzo Piccoli. I'm a research fellow at the Migration Policy Center, and I have two naive questions. I think probably because I never applied for a Horizon project, but I wonder how much important this idea of impact is for the academics who apply for it. Obviously, yes, for Horizon projects, I guess it tends to be rather important, but maybe in your interviews you come up with different degrees of how much people care. And I ask this because as part of my job as a researcher, I don't necessarily think that impact on policies should be important, especially, again, it depends how you measure impact. You discuss this. But if impact is about bringing about policy change, I do not think that that's my job, and that is relevant for the research that I do. So maybe the simple way to ask this question is whether there is variation in how the people you interview think that they should have any impact whatsoever on policies. And the second naive question, there is, again, an underlying assumption, I guess, that impact matters. And most of the people are frustrated because they do see little impact in their work. I wonder whether there are any exceptions or black swans that are really happy with the impact they had with their research, and it would be very interesting to hear about that. Maybe that's too early, that's not in the report, and that's going to be in the process innovation actions of your project, but if there is anything at all, that would be, I think, very interesting to hear. Thanks.
Thanks, Lorenzo. We also, I think, Margaret Greenfield, you put your hand up. So if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. No, this is actually reference to the question that I'd asked before my comment, sorry, which you actually picked up on. I was just being too sort of loud-mouthed and responded to the other. So one of the things I was interested in, because I was a policy practitioner before I became an academic, is actually trying to find out how much you've picked up in terms of what are the blocks and barriers in terms of implementation. Because I think we all know, as policy practitioners, what you've got, it's easier to have a sort of off-the-shelf model where you can adapt, whether incrementally or actually do something which aligns particularly to administration's specific concerns at that point. So I was just trying to find out if that's something which emerged, where it becomes there are this, and this, which are much easier to implement at this point, or these areas are the specific challenges, particularly having had, say, last year, so many changes of government and elections and the general shift to the far right or, centre right onwards within Europe. So it's a bit of a big question, but I wonder if there's anything that's emerged from that.
Thank you, Laurent. Eleonora, do you want to address those questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. So the first question so are there research gaps or migration research policy gaps? Well, if I have to sort of put my academic hat on, we sort of constantly look for sort of gaps in sort of research. So clearly the one goal here is to look for to sort of constantly look for research gaps and advance knowledge. At the same time, I think the point here is that there's no sort of evident gap, or this doesn't seem to be the problem here. What is more problematic in a way is the transmission chain between what we know and what we can do. So I don't think the main issue here is to produce more sort of knowledge, although we constantly think about what sort of knowledge we miss in what specific field, but this doesn't seem to be the main issue when it comes to engagement. There's a lack of research in a specific field. So how important the idea of impact might be for academics? So first of all, I think there might be selection bias built into this work. We look, as I said in the beginning, we look at the Horizon program. The Horizon program has a very strong component, which is part of and I think this is very interesting. It's part of the approach of the EU research policy, the EU's policy on research, which is seen as essentially advancing European integration. Up until now, it has had a very strong focus, among other things, on societal challenges. So in a way, there's a selection bias, because the researchers we speak to, one way or the other, apply for a program that has a very strong component that has to do with improving the status quo, without necessarily that meaning policy change, but there's a very strong component of that. At the same time, certainly, there's a lot of disagreement outside the Horizon program, very possibly also within the Horizon program, about whether academics should engage in policymaking or not. There's a whole debate on the sort of right not to engage of academics to decide which policies to engage with and which not. But clearly, in the Horizon program, which we are looking at the moment, there's a very strong direction in that respect. So we didn't really, to answer your question, we didn't really come across very strong oppositions. Instead, what we found is that there's a general agreement across the board that advancing knowledge and improving the status quo our shared goals. So exceptions, people that are very satisfied with the impact. I don't want to call anybody out, but I see Hannes is online. He has done a lot of work collecting data, so I don't know if he has an interesting example in mind. But I would say in general that researchers, so project coordinators, researchers tend to be more satisfied with the general impact of the project. Although obviously there's an element of frustration as well, or maybe just pragmatism with what can be achieved. But in general, those who seem to be a bit more disengaged with project results at the end is policymakers or practitioners, because they really see that the work gets up to a certain point, but then it's very difficult to take it further. So while the sort of knowledge component is usually of very good quality and rewarding and satisfying for researchers, regardless of the actual uptake, the overall assessment of policymakers and practitioners is less positive, because obviously it's more focused on policy-driven objectives. So any evidence of efforts responding to policy cycles, as I understand, I think in general, yes, in the sense that we have, so first of all, the topics, the objectives, the research questions that projects look at respond to an agenda that is also set by policymakers. So, and they are selected on the basis of policy relevance in a way. But at the same time, there's element of fatigue and lack of capacity as well with following the policy cycle, which obviously means not looking at the topic that is going to be relevant for 3 years, for 36 months, but essentially looking at what is relevant week by week or month by month, because this is what, this is the timeline of the policy cycle. It's not 3 years. So I think this is where we highlight differences in sort of timelines, because typically researchers would work with a policy relevance of 36 months, while policymakers and practitioners also act upon, obviously, a timeline that is much more shorter. So there is more in the level of months, if not weeks. So there's a mismatch there.
Thanks. Do we have any more questions, comments? Anybody would like to join us online with any comments or questions? We have we got 3 in the room immediately, so we'll stay in the room. Well, I saw your hand first. Do you want to introduce yourself for everybody online as well, please? Thank you.
So I'm Karina, and I'm a master's student at SDG, and I have a question about the engagement capacity. So just in general, I just was wondering about what's being done right now, and like what are the effects, if like, there are any, like, because like I know that it's a pretty new project, but yeah, I was just wondering about that.
I am Leisa, a researcher at the United Nations University and Friends of the MPC. I would like to know if in your fieldwork you found mixed profiles like Margaret, that I was seeing, people who work or have worked both in academia and in policymaking, which is something quite rare for my fieldwork. I found there was something quite rare in Europe, but not that rare in other world regions. I mean, in Latin America, it's something quite common, but also found out in other places, Bangladesh, in Africa as well. Well, if you found some of these mixed profiles, and how you address them in your sample.
Thanks. Caitlin Proctor from the MPC. Thanks so much, Eleonora. It was really, really interesting. I really liked your very helpful breakdown at the end of your presentation of kind of what works or what can work to make this a more integrated process. I was just wondering if anything sticks out in your mind or the other researchers who were involved from the interviews that you did of sort of very clear examples of good policy impact and what that looked like or at what level that was. And also if there are any very clear examples of the kinds of evidence that get contested more regularly, if you see any themes emerging there and kind of types of evidence. I mean, one of the points you made was the importance of comparative research, for example, saying, you know, single case studies are really easier to contest, but if there was anything else. And then another thing as well, if anything came up in the interviews or if you've seen any trends in academics' ideas of which level of policy is kind of easier to have a tangible impact at, and what's kind of understood, I suppose, by policy impact. Thanks.
Thank you. Engagement capacity. I guess you were referring to the work that we are doing for the project, right? So essentially, in addition to this work, at the moment we have upcoming the sort of launch. So we have worked on what we call an engagement toolkit. So we will be careful that the toolkit is duly sort of that people have time to engage with it and we can improve it. But we do have an engagement toolkit coming up. This is a collection of good practices or successful examples of engagement methods that have been collected by our partners at the Migration Policy Group. And so this will be a collection of tools that can be helpful for engagement in various ways. And so we are going to have a launch event in Brussels on the 18th of March for this. And we also have an engagement training upcoming here at the UI. Will be the first of a series of trainings on engagement methods, targeting both researchers, policymakers, and practitioners who want to dive into what else they can do to engage and collaborate with each other around research findings. And then we have other initiatives a bit along the line of what I described at the beginning. Regarding mixed profiles, yes, absolutely. We do have I would say a significant number of people with mixed profiles. They are well represented within the consortium as well, because we have people with academic or research backgrounds who now work for policy research organizations. And this is a recurring feature, I think, also in the Horizon projects that we spoke to. And these are policy researchers play the role of sort of knowledge brokers that I mentioned at some point. So they tend to facilitate or to be in the position to, they have familiarity with both academic research and, for example, the sort of policy cycle. And so they tend to be best placed to facilitate collaboration in that sense. So they also tend to have stronger professionalized capacity to do engagement, which is something that by training academics may not necessarily have. Very clear example of good policy impact. At what level and what kind of evidence get contested? So let me start because I have an example. Maybe I won't get into too much detail, but the kind of evidence that gets more easily contested is the one that is very clearly not aligned with the policy agenda. So I think this is what we can say a bit along the lines of the quote that I showed. So if there's a very well-defined course of action at any level, there is obviously much more resistant, or researchers perceive much more resistance to that specific piece of evidence that speak against that well-established course of action. At the same time, this is, I mean, the other side of the coin, or the story from the side of policymakers and practitioners is we have to sometimes work around the agenda that we have and the findings that you present, and we have to sort of strike a balance between what is feasible in a given point in time and what we know that should be done. So there's I think there's this sort of not so much a dichotomy here, but very much a continuum around what kind of evidence is contested. So very clear example of policy impact and at what level. I would say here, maybe this is something we can specify a bit more in the report. In general, the most successful examples of policy impact or engagement are the ones related to activities at the sort of local level. Where there's much more proximity with policymakers, public officials, and where there's also reportedly an important sort of facilitating role played by comparative work. So we have clear indications that, for example, in particular, local policymakers tend to be very eager to participate as stakeholders in projects. For example, even if they, for example, have a conservative political orientation, if they can learn about what other localities, for example, are doing. So that's a facilitating factor. And I think this is where the most positive experiences of engagement also lie. And so, yes, what level it's easier to have significant level of impact? Yes, I would say in general, what the interview, based on what the interviewees shared with us, that's more on the local level. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Eleonora. I think that's quite a lot of questions, so we've covered a lot of ground there. Thanks to everybody for the questions. It's been really good discussion, so I think we'll close here. Thanks to everybody who joined us in the room, thanks online, and obviously thanks to Eleonora for the presentation. I think we will be making the video of the presentation available. It's been a request about slides. I just have to clarify that with Eleonora about the availability of the slides because it's work in progress. So we'll make the video available online as soon as we work out how to do that, I suppose.